Hello, you're listening to On Israel, Al Monitor's podcast from Tel Aviv. This is Ben Caspit. All eyes in Israel are on January 20th, the day Joe Biden walks into the Oval Office and banishes the Trump era. Fast forward to President Biden's first meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Will the handshakes and smiles be overshadowed by Biden's disastrous visit to Israel 10 years ago, during which Israel announced the building of 1,600 housing units in East Jerusalem and set off a crisis with Washington? Can Netanyahu win over the new president and restart relations with the Democrats? Will the new administration follow Trump's lead in recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, Israeli sovereignty over the Golan, and the legality of the settlements? And what is to become of the momentum in Israel's relations with the Muslim Sunni states, which was generated by Washington's intensive engagement? And we haven't even mentioned the elephant in the room, Iran. Israel views the Biden administration's policy on Iran as nothing short of an existential issue for the Jewish state. Netanyahu will spare no effort in trying to convince the new administration to avoid a return to the nuclear deal with Iran, to maintain the sanctions on Tehran and the Trump administration's policy of maximum pressure on the Ayatollah's regime. Netanyahu knows the odds are stacked against him. The Democrats vividly remember how Netanyahu tried to torpedo the Iran nuclear deal, which was the crowning achievement of the Obama-Biden administration. Biden knows that Netanyahu was instrumental in undoing the deal and getting the U.S. to pull out of agreement through his alliance with Trump. The one person in the world who may be able to make sense of this complex drama that is about to unfold in Israel's relationship with Washington is Ambassador Dan Shapiro. He was Washington's man in Israel throughout most of the Obama years. He was there. He heard and saw it all. He experienced all the crises, the bitter exchanges, the happier moments, the scandals that erupted, and those that shall forever remain in the dark. Shapiro lives in Israel. He knows the Israelis very well and their leadership. He is also a true blue Democrat, a Washington insider, and a former senior official in the National Security Council. No one is better equipped to walk us through the minefield that the Israeli-American relationship is about to enter. Ambassador Dan Shapiro will be the guest of Al Monitor's On Israel podcast right after this short break.
If you're listening to this podcast, you obviously care about the Middle East, and if you do, you should probably be reading Al Monitor. Al Monitor is a global newsroom headquartered in Washington, D.C., with a network of over 160 contributors around the world. Al Monitor offers first-class reporting and analysis from a range of perspectives and an approach that represents the highest journalistic standards, as well as an award-winning commitment to press freedom and independence. If you haven't done so already, visit us at almonitor.com, check out our articles, and sign up for our free newsletters. There's a lot to choose from, including the Week in Review, an essay that offers unusual insights and forecasts into the region based upon Al Monitor's outstanding reporting. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe to our Al Monitor podcast on your favorite podcast platform, On Israel with Ben Caspit, and On the Middle East with me, Andrew Parasolidi.
We are delighted now to say hello to Ambassador Dan Shapiro. Shalom, Dan, and thank you for being here with us on Israel podcast in Al Monitor. Shalom.
Shalom, Ben. Good to talk to you. And don't forget, it's former ambassador.
Yes. No, but the Americans, correct me if I'm wrong, you have this title forever, like president, like ambassador, like secretary, isn't it right?
It is one of those honorifics that you do tend to carry with you. Yeah, Senator General, Secretary, but you can call me Dan, as you always have.
Okay. Okay, let's start with the hard topics. What do you expect to be the new administration's policies in the Middle East? And before going into the topics, in what place will be the Middle East situation in the new president's agenda? He has the coronavirus, he has a lot of global problems. What do you think will be our life here with the new administration?
Right. I think that's actually a very important question for context before one even gets into the specific policies on the Middle East. And by the way, I should just preface everything I say by saying I'm not involved with the Biden transition, so I speak only for myself. It's just my own analysis based on what I know, not anything official. But it is true, if you saw the first day that the transition website went live in mid-November, it had 4 pages of preloaded policy content, things they had actually done some work on and written up. And they were, of course, things you'd expect: COVID-19 recovery, economic crisis recovery, racial justice crisis and policies to address that, and climate change. These are the main 4 issues that the president-elect has come back to again and again during the transition. He gave a big speech the other night on pandemic response and the vaccine, and of course the economic recovery package. This is what he's focusing on, and I think it's what they will continue to make their primary focus and what they expect the American people to judge them on, at least in the early period. When you pull back from that to foreign policy issues, what are the issues that he has spoken about most often? I would say first and foremost, restoring the United States global alliances with NATO, with the countries of Asia, with the core of the US alliance system that has been under stress during the Trump years. Second would be restoring US leadership on the global multilateral problems and challenges and institutions. So COVID, climate, Paris Climate Accords, migration, nonproliferation, these kinds of things. Third would be the global strategic rivalry with China, which has every dimension: economic, security, military, and technology. And fourth would be Russia, which is still a major challenger to US interests around the world. So that's before you've even gotten to the Middle East. And I think it's fair to say that the Middle East, while important, and it's always going to be important, including, of course, the close US-Israel partnership and ensuring Israel's security, is not going to be the issue that will dominate the attention of the president and the vice president and the secretary of state as often as it may have in the past. Certainly Iran, and we'll get to it, I'm sure, will probably be an exception in that regard because of the risk of Iran's nuclear program. And certainly there will continue to be close partnerships, and Israel is first and foremost among them. But I do think that's important background and context for the rest of the discussion.
And as you said, we'll dive into the details a little later, but still generally speaking, can we have from you as the guy that was there almost the whole 8 years of the Obama administration and knows very intimately all the players in this new game, any tips, lessons, conclusions for how US and Israel can work together, even where there may be differences, or how will Bibi-Biden relationship play into it?
So the United States and Israel are close partners, obviously because of their shared strategic interests, the United States' interest in Israel's security, the fact that both of us have always had to work together to manage other challenges and crises in the region, from instability to terror to nonproliferation. Of course, Iran's aggressive activities and nuclear program are chief among those challenges. Of course, the shared values of our two democracies is another very important basis of the partnership. And nothing about that changes. And I think you will certainly see a Biden administration remain utterly committed to the U.S.-Israel security partnerships. Biden himself, as a senator and then as vice president, was very involved in supporting military assistance, as vice president of the Iron Dome and tunnel detection technology and intelligence sharing and joint training of the militaries, and of course the $38 billion MOU. He's also been, and I'm sure will be, very protective of Israel's legitimacy anywhere it's challenged, and its right to defend itself anywhere that is challenged, if it's by the UN or the Palestinians or at home by the BDS movement. And so I think those fundamentals are absolutely there. It's also true, of course, that at various points during this relationship, the United States and Israel have disagreements. And that is not an unnatural situation between two countries whose interests overlap very, very strongly, but are not identical. Israel is a smaller country. It's a regional power, but not a global power. It has obviously the proximity to these threats in a way that the United States doesn't. And the United States is larger and has different military capabilities and global responsibilities and other relationships. So it's not unexpected that these two countries will at times approach a common problem that they both care about somewhat differently, or maybe think of using different tools against that. It's not surprising that the United States and Israel, as two very close allies, but with with very close interests, but not identical interests because of their different size and capabilities and geographical proximities and global roles, might sometimes look at a common problem that they both care about through a different perspective, or choose to use different tools. Now, it's always been the case, and this was even true during the Obama administration, when there were, of course, some significant differences, that we have been able to sit down together in a professional way with the top leaders of the political and diplomatic and intelligence and military arms of our governments, and narrow the areas of disagreement and come up with common approaches, and obviously work through an issue that we both care about, and we both certainly care about each other, and try to work together. It doesn't mean always agreement, and obviously we know when disagreements have come up, but it certainly is doable. And one of the things that can help it, of course, is the personal connection between the president and the prime minister. We know that Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu have known each other for probably close to 40 years. It's a real friendship. I've spent time with them on Biden's 3 visits to Israel as vice president, and some of Netanyahu's visits to Washington. They really know each other. They can have very frank conversations, including about things they disagree. But I think they both see each other as real partners who really do, are really committed to this relationship. And that will obviously be part of the recipe of getting through points of disagreement, narrowing those areas of disagreement, and finding a common approach.
I want to go into this point exactly, because I remember one incident back when Vice President Biden visited Jerusalem, and during his visit, there was an announcement about 1,600 new housing units in Eastern Jerusalem. I know you were the ambassador, and it was a huge crisis, a real crisis. And I think if they were not such close friends for so many years, it could be a lot worse. So I'm trying to see the full half of this glass.
Well, that was in 2010. I was actually not ambassador. I was with the vice president on the trip. I was at that time at the National Security Council at the White House and traveling with him. And of course, it was during a period when George Mitchell, then our special envoy, had been working with Israel and the Palestinians to try to get negotiations started. Israel had agreed to a settlement moratorium a few months earlier. It didn't apply to East Jerusalem, but there was still some hope, obviously, to generally limit the number of announcements or the kinds of projects that were advanced during that period. And so the timing was obviously poor to have that happen during the vice president's big visit, and certainly the prime minister said that himself. It was I wouldn't say it was a major crisis. I really think that word got thrown around with a lot of abandon and exaggerated usage during those years. But it was a significant disagreement, and it actually opened the door to some conversations about what other steps the two countries could take together, and obviously how to encourage the Palestinians on their side to try to get negotiations underway. It was not a great successful effort to get negotiations underway, as we all know, and not only because of that issue, but it was a moment of disagreement. And it's the kind of thing where countries should not surprise each other. Countries should try to work out these types of disagreements when they happen, and they will happen, as much as possible, behind closed doors. It's something the president-elect and his team have said during the campaign this past year. And again, I don't think either. I can't speak for anybody else. I'd be very surprised if President-elect Biden goes into his work on the U.S.-Israel relationship dwelling at any length on that particular incident.
So if we're talking already about the Palestinian track, let me close this issue and ask you before talking about the elephant in the room, it's the Iranian issue. Do you think that President Biden will nominate a presidential special envoy to the Middle East, or even for a new initiative, a new peace initiative between Israel and Palestinians? Dennis Ross, a person you know very well, granted an interview to Yediot Ahronot today and said he hopes that there will be a Palestinian track, Israeli-Palestinian track. And finally, if you think maybe the Obama administration, maybe it was a mistake to waste 8 years on this route that leads us to nowhere.
Well, I don't know if it was a mistake in the sense that it is important. It's important for Israel's security and its future as a Jewish democratic state. That's important to the United States because that's the basis of our common values relationship, which enables every other aspect of the relationship, including the security partnership. It's important because of Palestinian legitimate rights for independence in a state of their own. It's important because of the contribution it makes to a better situation in the region. So I don't think it was a mistake to try. I'm not sure everything that was done was the right thing to do. Undoubtedly, mistakes were made. I also think the main responsibility for the lack of progress is on parties who just weren't really able or willing to make those kinds of necessary steps. But that's looking backwards, and I don't want to spend too much time on that.
Right.
Look, I don't know whether a special envoy will be appointed. That's kind of a bureaucratic decision. And, obviously has some impact on where this issue lands in the prioritization for the administration's work. But there's no question, as President-elect Biden said during the campaign, he continues to believe very strongly that a two-state solution in which Israel and a Palestinian state can live in peace and security with one another is the goal, should remain the goal of U.S. policy. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean beginning or trying to begin a negotiation on the final status arrangements of that agreement in the near term. The same leaders are still in place who have had previous unsuccessful negotiations. They really don't trust each other. There's a lot of mistrust at the public society, not to immediately drive to the solution, but rather to work on how do you keep it alive? How do you sustain the viability of a two-state solution for some more years when there's a lot of disbelief it's still possible, when many people are starting to say they don't even support it, and when certainly the Trump administration did not seem committed to anything that looked like what I think the more common definition of a two-state solution is. So I do think that the approach will be focused on that sustainment, which involves improving conditions on the ground, economic conditions, security cooperation, getting Palestinians to make some of the changes they need to make, such as ending the payments to the prisoners in Israeli jails who've committed acts of violence, ending delegitimization and incitement, certainly trying to get Israel to do less on expanding settlements and end any talk of annexation. But also there's a new tool, the Middle East Peace Partnership Act that Congress just passed to create a fund to dramatically scale up people-to-people programs between Israelis and Palestinians to strengthen the Palestinian private sector, which includes a lot of very dynamic and sort of forward-looking young high-tech entrepreneurs who can really be partners with Israel. And then, of course, there's the opportunity represented by the Abraham Accords. The normalization between Israel and Arab states is a great thing on its own merits, something that President-elect Biden supported as soon as it was announced. In fact, it may be the only sort of Trump administration foreign policy initiative about which he was very, very positive during the campaign. He welcomed it. He said it follows on work he did and other administrations have done to get Israel the rightful recognition it deserves in the region. And he would push it forward and try to get other nations to join. And he hopes that it can also be a source of positive momentum in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, that there's things Arab states who have normalized with Israel can do to support and in some ways pressure Palestinians towards building the institutions and making the changes they need to support and have a different kind of conversation with Israelis on the same subject. So that this will undoubtedly be part of the administration's approach, I think. I can't say whether it would be a special envoy in charge of it or an assistant secretary or the local ambassadors. But I do think this will be a policy that will get some attention and at which there are actually some interesting opportunities at this moment.
So you saved one question that I wanted to ask you about the momentum between Israel and the Sunni states. You say that you think it will go on, and President Biden supports it. But can I ask you, if he supports the Abraham Accords, will he try to reverse other decisions or other things or presents that President Trump gave Israel, like recognizing Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, settlements, etc.?
It's a question I think the new administration will have to decide once they get in. Some things won't be reversed. He said very clearly during the campaign that the U.S. Embassy will remain in Jerusalem. I think that answers the question about recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. I think the others will certainly be reviewed. And he has talked about obviously restoring a U.S. Palestinian diplomatic track, which really kind of withered. It basically has been non-existent for the last 3 years, to ensure that the United States can be a productive mediator between the two parties. That it may include a consulate in Jerusalem, it may include an office for the appeal in Washington, it may include other channels, and it probably will include at least restoring certain streams of humanitarian and economic assistance, not necessarily to the Palestinian Authority itself, but to the Palestinian people. So, those are opportunities. I think, of course, there will be a different view on the question of settlements than the Trump administration's view. Exactly how that will be expressed and exactly what policies they might change or do differently, I think those are details that they'll decide only after they begin.
Okay, let's we reached Iran, and as you know very well, this is the core, maybe even existential issue here in Israel, not only for Prime Minister Netanyahu. And what can be done, in your opinion, in order to let Israel this time be in the room or close to the room of the negotiation? It's not a secret that the new administration will try and act to resume the negotiation with the Iranian regime. And you know that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not in favor of going back to that the agreement, the nuclear agreement between the United States and the superpowers and Iran. Can Netanyahu do something in order to improve his position vis-a-vis Washington when they're going back to the negotiation table with Iran?
So the first thing I think is just important to emphasize is that, as I understand it, neither President-elect Biden nor anyone who will be working with him will have any illusions about the nature of the Iranian regime, about Iran's malign intentions toward Israel and toward others in the region, about its pursuit of nuclear weapons, its support for terrorism, its missile program, and the dangers that all of those things pose. And he has said very clearly that under no circumstances will Iran be permitted to get a nuclear weapon. So those are, just some important foundational points. A couple other facts that sort of he has to deal with coming in is that Iran today is much closer to a nuclear weapon, to being able to break out and achieve one, because of the uranium it is enriching, because of the centrifuges it is installed, all in violation of the Iran nuclear deal. But all that started only after President Trump withdrew from the deal in 2018. So the deal kept Iran at least a year from a weapon, verified through inspections. Today, they're much, much closer, 2, 3, 4 months from that weapon. So that has to be dealt with. It's also true Iran continues to be very aggressive in the region, in Iraq, in Yemen, and of course in Syria, where Israel has to continue to strike Iranian targets. And it's also true that the U.S. Under the Trump administration has been very isolated, has really had some support. It had Israel and the Saudis and the UAE supporting its maximum pressure policy on Iran and withdrawal from the JCPOA, but it had no support from Europe, no support from most other countries, and couldn't get various initiatives like the arms embargo and the snapback of sanctions through at the United Nations because of that. It's also true, one last sort of prefatory point, that the maximum sanctions of the Trump policy have had real effect on Iran's economy and caused significant damage there. It's not exactly clear where that goal was. Was it to change the regime? Was it to change the nuclear program? Was it to change all the policies, as Secretary Pompeo laid out in a speech a couple of years ago, 12 things that he wanted to see Iran do differently, which I frankly agree with all of them. But none of that has happened. The nuclear program has advanced. The regime is the same terrible regime, and all of that continues. So what President-elect Biden did say during the campaign, and his advisors have said since, is that he's prepared to return to the JCPOA in the context of mutual compliance. So obviously that means Iran meeting all of its obligations that will push it back to the year breakout timeline. But of course, that deal will be farther along, 5 years into a deal that lasts 10 to 15 years. And so that has to be dealt with. But he has also said that his real strategic objective is not going back into the JCPOA. That's essentially a preliminary step, and a step that, if it's done, and there may be other ways to do it, by the way, that buys time, that sort of takes us away from Iran right on the cusp of a nuclear weapon in order to buy time to deal with this issue over a longer period of time. What his real strategic objective is a much longer term agreement, much longer than the 10 to 15 years of the JCPOA, and an agreement that is much broader, that it applies not just to nuclear technologies, but to other technologies like ballistic missiles, and that is much stronger in its inspections and its other enforcement mechanisms, and that also deals with Iran's very negative regional activities, support for terror and undermining of various Arab states and the like. Now, that is an agreement, that is a strategic goal on which I think there's a lot of convergence between the United States and Israel, and probably the Arab Gulf states, and the Europeans as well. There's a lot of countries that can get unified around that objective. And my feeling is that if at the very beginning of the administration, the United States and Israel sit down in that kind of high level, very professional dialogue that we have conducted in the past that I referred to earlier, that is the way we have always worked through issues that we both agree are important, but may have some different approaches on, that there will be great deal of openness in a Biden administration to have that dialogue, that Israel will be able to make important contributions, as it always has, in intelligence and other perspectives, and that they can help shape the combination of pressures and incentives and sanctions and negotiations and the whole environment that could draw Iran into the negotiation on that much longer term, much broader, much stronger agreement, which I think everybody can agree would be a better outcome. So if they both administrations approach it from that perspective of cooperation and narrowing areas of disagreement, you can't always eliminate them, but working through them toward common objectives over the longer term, I think it can still be a very productive discussion.
The fact that I don't have any follow-up questions in this issue, I think shows that it was a very thorough answer, and I thank you for this, Dan. And can you tell me if, in your opinion, can Netanyahu or Israel fix the relationship with the Democratic Party? It's not a secret that the Prime Minister gambled, put all his coupons or jetons on the Trump and Republican Party in the last 4 years. This gamble is not very successful right now. Is it possible to renew the old days where there was a bipartisan support to Israel in the Capitol Hill, etc.?
Well, the heart and the strength of the U.S.-Israel relationship has always been its bipartisan nature, and that there has been a bipartisan consensus around it, so that when one administration changes or when party control in Congress changes, the fundamentals of the relationship are not affected. And, despite all the discussion about different voices in the Democratic Party and, some new perspectives, if you still look at what was in the Democratic platform, and I was a member of the Democratic Platform Committee and I worked on this, it sounds very much like Joe Biden. And so when you listen to Joe Biden's policies, and when you look at what the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives said when it spoke to this issue in 3 or 4 resolutions and other statements over the last year, you find those same principles and kind of foundational commitments really are unchanged. A strong commitment to Israel's security, to Israel's ability to defend itself, to the U.S.-Israel security partnership with unconditioned U.S. aid that helps Israel defend itself from all the threats it faces, a strong commitment to defending Israel's legitimacy anywhere that is called into question, abroad and at home, and a fundamental commitment to helping Israel achieve peace with its neighbors. That includes a 2-state solution with the Palestinians, and it includes advancing normalization between Israel and its other Arab neighbors. Those are fundamentals that I think, again, around which there's an enormous amount of bipartisan agreement in the United States, and should be a good basis for agreement between Israel and a democratically controlled Washington. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't differences from the Trump administration's approach. And so I think that's one of the kind of realities that everyone will need to adjust to, is that a new administration and will not necessarily follow the exact Trump model. I think indeed it's clear that there will be changes. And so if a going in position is that the main goal should be to get the Biden administration to cut and paste the Trump policies, that's probably not a very successful approach. But I think people are realistic, and going in with an open and serious dialogue to narrow areas of disagreement, but reinforce those very strong principles of agreement, I think can keep this relationship in a very strong and bipartisan foundation. That'll certainly be the approach from the Biden administration side.
Last question, and on the personal level, Dan Shapiro, we are used to talk here in Israel about the risk, the grave risk to the Israeli fragile democracy. And I wanted to ask you, how did you feel when we all saw and could not believe our eyes, the pictures of the Trump supporters storming Capitol Hill, Senate and Congress, and doing whatever they did there? How did you feel as an American?
Well, as an American and as somebody who worked for many years on Capitol Hill, and I know those rooms and those buildings very well. To me, they are the Holy of Holies, really sacred ground of our democracy. It was, first of all, heartbreaking, but it was also, I was also outraged. This was an insurrection intended to disrupt our democratic functions as called for by our Constitution, to ratify, really in basically a pro forma way, the outcome of a free and fair election. And it was incited by President Trump based on a lie that he has told even before the election, but every day since the election, that the ballots were false and phony and fraudulent, and that he actually won. And he didn't win. It's something he couldn't accept just because of, I guess, his I don't want to speculate, but I suppose his personality. He can't accept that he lost. He did lose, but he convinced, unfortunately, tens of millions of Americans that lie was true, and that Joe Biden was not the legitimate president-elect, which of course he is. And since some number of those people followed his instructions to come to Washington and with violent intent to go and prevent the Congress from carrying out its duty. Obviously, it was tragic. 5 people died, including a Capitol police officer. It could have been far, far worse. There were clearly people with violent intent looking for Speaker Pelosi, Vice President Pence, President Trump's own vice president. And as bad as it was, it could have been even worse. And even though it ended, and of course the election was upheld, and President-elect Biden will be inaugurated on January 20th, it leaves a very deep scar among all the people who really believe that our democracy could never be sort of called into question, and that we would always have a peaceful transition of power. This is not a peaceful transition of power. People have already died, and Washington is now locked down with 10 or 20,000 National Guard troops to ensure that there isn't a repeat of it on Inauguration Day. That's on President Trump. He is responsible for that. He certainly earned the impeachment that the House of Representatives imposed on him a few days ago. The Senate will have to take it up and decide whether or not to convict him of those charges. He certainly deserves it. And it's a grave damage he's done to our democracy, and I'm afraid it will be with us for quite some time.
Former Ambassador Dan Shapiro, it was a fascinating talk. Thank you very much for being with us. We will go to another quick break and come back with some conclusions. Thank you, Dan. Shalom.
My pleasure, Ben. Thank you.
I'm Andrew Parasiliti, president of the award-winning media news site El Monitor, where we cover the Middle East with some of the best reporters and columnists anywhere. And I'm excited to announce our new podcast on the Middle East. where each week I will interview newsmakers from the U.S. and the region about the latest news and trends with additional commentary from our on-the-ground correspondents. Those of you who follow the region know that what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. And to cite another great movie line, every time the U.S. tries to get out, the region pulls us back. Your time is valuable, so let me promise you this. You will learn something and you will never be bored, because each week we'll be talking with and listening to those leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in this critical and fascinating region. So please subscribe to On the Middle East with me, Andrew Parasolidi.
Thank you for staying with us. I think it was a highly interesting conversation with many headlines. On the Palestinian issue, Ambassador Shapiro said that he does not know if the president will nominate a special envoy to the Middle East, but he does know that the Middle East in general and the Israeli-Palestinian negotiation in particular is not on the short list of the Biden administration. It's not in the first 4 topics that occupy right now the administration. So he thinks maybe there will not be a resuming of the Israeli-Palestinian track, but maybe trying to keep it alive, to keep the idea, the two-state solution alive, maybe opening the Palestinian office in Washington again, and the consulate, the American consulate in Eastern Jerusalem, etc. Moving to the Iranian track, I think whatever Ambassador Shapiro just said will be very good, will be heard in a very positive way to Israeli ears, because the ambassador did not deny that the administration is going to resume a negotiation with Tehran. But he said that in his opinion, President Biden is not going to go back to the same agreement with Iran, but to start to try to produce a different agreement, to extend the timeline and to deal also with the ballistic missile program and the Iranian behavior in the Middle East, etc. And I think this can calm some of the Israeli fears in Jerusalem. I asked the ambassador about the incident of storming the Capitol Hill by the Trump supporters, and he was very, very sharp. He called it heartbreaking, and he said that President Trump earned his impeachment. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we will see you back here next Monday. I'm Ben Caspit. Take care. Bye-bye.